I've had the same student in my class for 17 years. Teaching was my calling, and I entered the profession wide-eyed and filled with innocence. Although my first year had many bumps in the road, my classroom became a thriving community where learning flourished, or so I'd like to think. I remember every student from my first year. I can still recite the class roster alphabetically 17 years later. Their faces are forever burned into my mind, and I cherish those memories to this day. On the first day of my second year, I was filled with joy as one of my former students walked through the door, Dawn Beasley. Dawn was a sullen and withdrawn child, and I had struggled mightily to connect with her, as did her classmates. Preparing to reassure a kid with the first day jitters, I approached her for a hug. Instead of embracing me, Dawn stared at me like I was a perverted stranger and backed away. Without a word, she slipped off her backpack and sank into a chair in the back row, her seat from last year. "Sweetie, you know I love seeing you, but this isn't your class anymore. We can catch up later, but if you don't hurry, you'll be late." I spoke to Dawn in my calmest teacher voice, hoping I wouldn't make her feel unwanted. Rather than acknowledge my request, Dawn stared ahead in silence, firmly planted in her chair. "Dawn, I know you're nervous, but you can't camp out here as much as I would like that. Come back later today and I promise I'll find time to chat." To my great annoyance, Dawn remained in her seat, staring at me with blank eyes. The other students began noticing the brewing power struggle, causing them to whisper excitedly among themselves. Having a former student blatantly disregard my directions was not an ideal start to the school year. It was a problem I'd have to nip in the bud. "I'm not going to say this again. It's time to leave." I filled my voice with every ounce of authority I had in me. I expected some reaction, but Dawn just sat there expressionless. For the first time in my career, my anger boiled over. My patience is gone. "Put on your backpack now." I strode over towards Dawn and forcefully grabbed her by the arm. "Class, stay in your seats until I get back." For the entirety of the walk to the principal's office, we remained in silence. Not that it seemed to matter to Dawn. She hadn't said a word through the entire ordeal. "Mrs. Avenatti, I need you to deal with this child." Despite not being my student, she refused to leave my class after all clear directives. I'm at a loss. I threw my hands up in the air to signal my frustration. For a moment, the principal stayed silent, a perplexed look etched into her face. She seemed to be struggling to formulate an appropriate response, as if the words were filed away in some seldom used cabinet. "I'm a bit confused. What do you mean by not your student?" She barely masked her irritation, astounded at the perceived stupidity of my actions. Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. I felt reality crumble around me. Dawn was in my class the previous year, of this I was sure. But Mrs. Avenatti was not one to joke, and her face betrayed no feeling other than displeasure. I must have missed her name on the class roster. "I'm so sorry for this intrusion. I guess I have the first day jitters." But my nervous laughter did nothing to lighten the tension. Head held low, I walked back to my classroom with Dawn. All of the questions racing through my mind, I forced out of my consciousness. I had students to teach, and they were my priority. "Class, I apologize for my behavior earlier. Even teachers make mistakes sometimes. I'd like to welcome back Dawn. She'll be joining us for the year after all." I made no attempt to explain myself further, and even if I had wanted to, what explanation could I give? Nothing made sense, and for the first time in my life, I felt utterly lost. The day went by at a snail's pace. Every other minute I glanced at the clock, barely able to concentrate. I did my best to avoid Dawn. Being in her presence caused a visceral reaction that manifested physically. Something deep inside of me was begging me to run. A primal fear passed down in our genes by half-starved ancestors fleeing from giant beasts of old. As soon as the last bell rang, I quickly ushered my students out the door. Dawn was the last one to leave, slowly trailing behind the others. Before she left, she turned around, lips pursed into a victorious smirk, and gave me a wink. My head felt bloated on the drive home, filled to the brim with impossibilities, till the gears in my head came to a grinding halt, unable to process the events of the day. I felt so confident in my position. Dawn had been my student. Every fiber of my being knew it to be true, screeching at me in agreement. Still, doubts had arisen I couldn't shake. Was I going insane? Hands trembling, I pushed open the door to my apartment, my cat meowing happily as I entered. Without hesitation, I rushed towards my filing cabinet and pulled out a file labeled school year 2001 to 2002. Filled with anxiety, fearful of what I might find, I dumped the contents of the file onto the floor. Tests, report cards, field trip forms, and all other manner of school-related documents scattered around me. Like a man possessed, I combed through every single paper, hoping I'd find evidence of Dawn. My first thought was the class photo, but I quickly remembered she was out with the flu that week, a planned act. Digging endlessly through graded papers and quizzes, I couldn't find a single one with Dawn's name attached to it. There didn't seem to be a shred of proof that Dawn had ever been in my class. After almost 2 hours of searching, I was ready to throw in the towel and accept whatever came next. That was until, out of the corner of my eye, I spotted a small scrap of notebook paper folded so many times you'd probably notice it. Heart racing, I unfolded the paper, my clammy hands soaking the edges. The note read as follows: Dear Mr. Wagner, your class was so fun. You are so nice and so fun. I want to be in your class again. That would make me so happy. Can I do that? Okay, thank you. Dawn. I pumped my fist into the air, a short moment of sweet vindication. Then, reality came crashing down onto me. Everyone but myself had no recollection of Dawn. Their memories of her vanished like a puff of smoke on a windy day. With a handwritten note and a head full of memories no one else could corroborate, I knew no sane person would believe me. Once again, I felt utterly lost. With no family support, no savings, piles of student debt and bills, and no other job prospects, I resigned myself to the fact that I'd have to return to work. My teaching style completely changed my second year. No longer was I the energetic teacher constantly floating around the room ready to offer additional support. I was a shell of myself, a deflated husk who rarely left the sanctity of his desk. Unlike me, Dawn was the same girl she had always been. Withdrawn and quiet to the point of near silence, little more than a shadow on the wall. Most of my days were spent observing her movements, trying to understand whatever I was dealing with. Dawn never interacted with other students. At the lunch table, her peers would give her a wide berth. Despite otherwise crowded tables, Dawn would always have several feet between her and the nearest children. Dawn never smiled. Her facial expressions never changed, other than the one notable occasion. The aptest word for Dawn was neutral. She showed no emotions. Her eyes were dead and soulless, causing me to shiver every I saw them. Worst of all, Dawn never missed a day, that is, except class picture day. In later years, that became a high holiday of sorts for me, a blessed day. During that year, I applied everywhere, but no one would hire me. I was overqualified, underqualified, and my personal favorite, just not what we're looking for right now. Though my discouragement grew, and by the summer I could barely find the motivation to send a single application a month. As my job prospects withered before my eyes, the bills began stacking up even higher. My car's electrical system had to be replaced. My mom needed money for medication. My dog had to have knee surgery. The hits kept coming. By August of 2003, I was debt-ridden and financially unstable, in poor health due to stress, and terrified beyond reason as the first day of school rapidly approached. Sweat dripped down my brow as a new flock of students shuffled into my classroom. I uttered a weak hello as they found their seats. I had looked over the class roster endlessly. and Dawn's name was absent every time. Still, I remained fearful. The students groaned as the shrill school bell rang. The first day had officially begun. A room full of eyes focused on me, waiting for instruction. Breathing deeply, I arose from my chair and introduced myself. "Good morning, students, and welcome to the second grade. My name is Mr. Wagner." My voice was flat, devoid of interest. "Good morning, Mr. Wagner." A chorus of voices responded. The following hour was spent overviewing rules and expectations. As that hour passed, I felt the color begin returning to my face. A certain joy, a certain freedom that I had almost forgotten crept back into my heart. Dawn was nowhere to be seen, and I couldn't be happier about it. My mood lightened, interactions with students were more positive, and everything about my demeanor improved. A weight had been lifted off my shoulder, while some life with a chip, I had been living with a boulder. Lunch came and went, and the students obediently followed me back to the classroom. This year would be different, I thought to myself, a wide grin plastered on my face. Ready to start anew, I gallantly strode into the classroom. "Mr. Wagner, you have a late registration joining your class." The words cut through me like a serrated knife. Dawn stood nervously behind Miss Avanati, clenching her arm tentatively. The color I had only gained back moments ago drained quickly from my face. "I believe Ms. Richards has a smaller class size. Shouldn't she be getting the new student?" I practically vomited the words onto the floor. "In most cases, yes, but Dawn's parents specifically asked for you because of all the great things they've heard. I decided to honor their request. And may I say, keep up the great work, Mr. Wagner." "Thank you. It means the world," I replied through gritted teeth. Misery crashed over me, dragging me down into the dark abyss. Just being near Dawn made my skin crawl. I could barely look at her. Another year with her seemed unbearable, if only I knew. My teaching career lasted 17 years. During that time I married, was gifted 2 beautiful daughters, and bought a modest home on a quiet suburban block. Despite all the change, one constant remained in my life: Dawn. Year after year, she'd find her way onto my class roster. I taught her in Iowa, California. Strange and violent occurrences followed Dawn everywhere she went. I'd describe her as a poison, slowly seeping into a town's consciousness and driving weaker souls mad. Soon after we'd moved to a town, there would be a sharp increase in abnormal behavior and tragic events. Children went missing, otherwise normal individuals committed horrific acts, and drug addiction would run rampant, among other things. Despite the chaos swirling around us, tragedy had never struck my family. I had protected them from the truth, shielding them from that burden I carried it alone. My children were my sole purpose for living, the only reason I managed to soldier on for so long. "Daddy," I made a new friend. My youngest daughter's tender voice echoed through the house. "I want you to come and meet her. I think she knows you." "Well, you know, I am pretty famo," I choked on my joke as I walked into the kitchen. Arms slung around my daughter's shoulder, greasy strands of black hair obscuring her dyes, was Dawn. For the second time in 17 years, I saw her ghastly smile, this time revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. Sasha, come to me, and I screamed to my daughter in terror. But it was too late. Dawn clasped her jaws around my daughter's neck, shaking her like a rag doll. Dropping down onto all fours, Dawn skittered away with blinding speed, crashing through a window in the foyer. I write this to you from prison, hoping anybody will believe my story. Lawyers, police, judges, and even my own family have cast my story aside as rubbish. If I am not freed soon, I believe my death is imminent. You see, there's a new prison guard patrolling the cell block. Her greasy strands of hair dangle over dead, pale eyes always watching me. So when the long night is over, dawn rises once again. Next story. My online film student kept filming the same dead tree. Last semester, a film student named Jacob submitted a video that made me so horrified that I had to call the dean 0.00 a.m. She advised me to turn the clip over to the police. I teach filmmaking at an art college in Maryland. During the COVID lockdown in late 2020, my filmmaking course was online. My usual first assignment would have the students go out and film any setting. With an online class, the students just film around their houses. Most students were happy to show off their gaming setup and action figures collection. A student named Jacob put his camera on a tripod and filmed a dead oak tree in his backyard for about 5 minutes. I asked him to film some close-ups. He replied that he was too afraid. For continuity editing, I normally have students film a chase sequence or a snowball fight. For online, students just filmed themselves cooking or playing with their pets. Jacob submitted a video of himself tying a noose. He then hung a mannequin on the same dead oak tree. I started to get creeped out, but I had to put on a brave face. Horror and film students always go hand in hand. I don't want to appear like I was easily spooked. I jokingly asked Jacob if he was no longer scared of getting close to the tree. He said he wanted to scare it. I asked who, and he replied the jester. For the next assignment, Jacob submitted a clip of a man who I thought was Jacob put on a medieval jester costume and a smiling mask dancing around the dead oak tree. It was in black and white and was beyond disturbing. I'm used to horror movies being submitted to me by students, but those were gory and wild and fun. This clip was just eerie. I asked him where he got the costume. He said that wasn't him. I didn't press further. Usually I would ask, but with online class, I just assumed it was a family member. After class, Jacob messaged me privately and asked if his videos of the tree made me sick. I was confused and thought he meant if I was sick of seeing the same tree over and over. Against my preference, I said no. If he found a muse which inspired him, then he should stick with it as long as he can. It felt like the right thing to say at the time. I found out from other professors that Jacob began incorporating the dead oak tree into all that he did. In photography class, he retouched a photo of a car crash onto a photo of the dead oak tree. In digital illustration class, he drew the dead oak tree with a bunch of dead animals hanging from it. Other students noticed Jacob's obsession with the dead oak tree as well and started talking to me about it. An aspiring YouTuber named Matt asked me if he could submit a Let's Play for an assignment. I normally would say no, but because everybody was in home isolation at the time, I thought, why not? Just add a lot of narration. Matt then invited me to watch him play PUBG Live on Twitch. When I did, I was amused to see that Jacob was one of his team members. I asked Matt after the stream how he knew Jacob. Matt said that Jacob was his neighbor only a few houses down the road from him. And to my surprise, they didn't live that far from me either, only 2 blocks away. I even thought about walking over to see Jacob's dead oak tree after the COVID lockdown ended. Matt told me what happened to Jacob back when they were in middle school. Jacob was home alone and a man knocked on the door telling Jacob that he used to live in that house. The man asked his father to build him a tree house. And just when the father was about to finish it, he fell from the tree and broke his neck. It's been over 2 decades since he moved away, and the man told Jacob he just wanted to see the oak tree again. Jacob didn't let him inside but said that he can go around and look at it in the backyard. Jacob played video games until his parents came home, where they found the man in a full jester costume dancing around the tree. The semester after, in early 2021, Jacob wasn't taking any of my classes, but a cinematography professor video called me about one of Jacob's videos. The assignment was to light up a night scene, and Jacob just filmed a handheld POV shot of him circling around a tree with a flashlight. She told me that the tree in the video was not a tree in Jacob's backyard. Jacob told her it was a tree in my backyard. I didn't even end the video call. I just sprinted out onto my balcony to take a look at my tree, and then took a look at the footage again. It was I was so frightened I could throw up. I video called Jacob immediately. I asked him to turn on his camera so we could talk face to face. Without sounding angry, I asked him why he was in my backyard. He explained that he cut down his dead oak tree last semester. The dead oak tree that was featured in his work after that had always been my tree. I just realized that none of his works that featured the tree after my class was a video. Jacob used the photo of my tree he found on my Facebook profile. Jacob said that an entity wearing a jester costume had been sneaking into my backyard, slowly killing my tree. I didn't notice my tree was dying because it was during the winter time. Jacob was at my house that one time to try to capture the jester on camera. He did it once during the mise en scene assignment, and that was when he knew it was not just him who saw it. I was frustrated and scared, but I didn't want to upset him. I told him that he should have told me if he was coming over. A few days later, at about 11 p.m., Matt was live streaming, and I was watching him on Twitch. I was shocked to see Jacob burst through Matt's bedroom door. He was covered in cuts and bruises. Shards of glass were all over his body and his shirt was soaked in blood. Fresh blood was still dripping down from his forehead. Matt fell out of his chair screaming at the top of his lungs, rightfully freaking out. I'll give Matt credit for not cursing and chasing Jacob out of his room. Matt asked Jacob what was wrong. Jacob looked into the camera and asked if I am watching. He told me to look in my backyard. The jester was there. There were about 20 people in the chat. Some of them were my students. I, a dependable student in the chat, asking her toll 911 and told Matt to render basic first aid for Jacob. I went outside to look and I was shocked to see a car crash into my tree. I didn't hear anything because I was wearing headphones and apparently none of my neighbors did. I couldn't even see the car until I turned on my backyard light. But the crash was a big one. The car was totaled and there were shards of broken glass everywhere. Nothing was on fire. The car's engine was not on. Just when I was about to call the police, I got a notification that someone had uploaded a large file to our department's file storage. I opened it, and it was a video clip said to be uploaded by Jacob's username. It showed Jacob placing a camera on the back seat of his car. He turned from his driver's seat and stared into the camera. My mouth was wide open when I saw another person in the passenger seat, wearing a jester costume. Without turning back around to face forward, Jacob, still looking into the camera, just stepped on the gas and crashed into my tree. As the crash happened, I could see the jester's unmasked face in a split second. It was not human. I decided to call the dean after I called the police. She was equally horrified after looking at the clip. She told me to save the clip in case the police need it. She asked me who the man in the jester costume was. She probably didn't pause to see his monstrous face. I told her that I couldn't find anybody else at the crash, but I had a gut feeling that Jacob saved me from the jester that night. Next story. I work at a university library. I'm afraid one of the students isn't alive. Heather always struck me as a weird kid, although a very sweet one. She seemed way younger than her peers, like the runt of a litter. But I more than once overheard other students talking about her being some sort of teenage genius. As it happens to most brilliant people, she didn't seem to pay a lot of attention to the world around her, but she tried her best. I heard you had a nasty car accident, Miss Thompson. Are you too hurt? She asked me just the other week, her eyes full of genuine concern. I think you're mistaking me for another librarian, darling, I replied. Then went back to reading my own book. Our uni was a big complex, with 4 major libraries, with 3 or more librarians each, and a few smaller ones. Funnily, all of us lived up to the librarian stereotype very well, 30 or 40 something, tortoise eyeglasses, hair in a perfect bun, a pencil dress topped with a cardigan. There wasn't much to do these days, as our collection was completely cataloged in the uni's app, so we were there mostly to handle paperwork and help with the restricted section, one of the only places that remained completely free from the modern world scrutiny. Most students had no interest in the library, let alone in the forbidden books, so I had all the time in the world to just go around hissing she if I wanted to. It was the perfect job for any introvert, a quiet place with little to no interaction. Lately, my days consisted of silently watching over people. Heather, I heard, was pursuing a scientific career, but she always had a dreamy look on her face when she read our books. We were located in the history department. I only became concerned when she started asking for witchcraft books from the restricted section. Oh, I'm just doing some research for fun. Interesting how women turn to magic because it seems to be the easier way for us to gain power, huh? She gave me a half smile. She was so pale and clearly concerned about something big. I couldn't help but peek over her shoulder a little. How to create a new human body. Wax. It must amount to 2/3 of the person's original weight. An object they held dear in life. This will bind the soul. The ashes from any book. See above how to ensure that you obtain this material minimizing loss. As much hair from the subject as possible. This ingredient will give the new body verisimilitude. Please remember that the above is meant to give a new body to a person that's barely clinging to life. If your subject has already passed, it's crucial to add their own ashes and blood from a living fox. In this case, the fox will act as a recipient for the soul and must stay beside the person at all times. Obviously, this was all bullshit. I'm a rational, 33 years old woman after all. I know better still. Heather was so pale, her lips were so bluish, that I feared that she was either terminally ill or already dead. Which is a ridiculous thought, but come to think of it, I didn't see her interacting with anyone else but me in the last couple of weeks. Besides, she was a smart kid. If she was dedicating this much time to such things, maybe they held more than historical interest. I was intrigued and had too much time in my hands. My fiancé had been staying at the hospital with his sick mother lately, and I didn't have any pets or roommates, so I had to admit things were a little too lonely. So over the next few days, I helped Heather get some ancient witchcraft books, then casually walked behind her, looming like a ghost, stealthy as a cat. There was no doubt she was particularly interested in reviving people through old sorcery. The dark circles under her eyes grew bigger by the day, her hair was matted and tangled, and I started convincing myself that she looked like she was rotting alive. It was a Friday when I couldn't hold back anymore and decided to ask her if she was dying. I gave the poor girl a jump scare. "Oh, it's you, Miss Thompson," she muttered. "No, I'm not dying. This is for someone I know. They must be really important to you." Then I replied, "Well, we're not really close, but I think her dying now would be horribly unfair," she replied, biting her incredibly pale lips. Looking closer, I realized she looked so bad because she hadn't been sleeping or eating properly, focused on her research. "You're a good girl, Heather," I praised her, then started leaving. "Miss Thompson?" "Yes, Unzelf, the dying person is you." I laughed. "I'm not ill, sweetie. Thanks for worrying. Yes, you're not ill. You're in a coma with no hope of returning, and your body is not actually here." Heather took me to the hospital, where I saw my own body fading, a feeling so eerie it's hard to explain. There was no doubt it was me, badly injured and hanging to life by a thread. When you've been in a coma for weeks like I had, it's hard to come back from it. And even if you do, your muscles will malfunction and your body will be so weak that you're prone to catching a myriad of infections and dying anyway. My sister is a nurse here. That's how I found out about you," Heather explained, in a whisper, as she cut a huge piece of my hair. I couldn't stop staring at my physical body. It was so pale, nearly lifeless. Unfortunately, the ritual can only extend your life for a few years, a decade at best. And it can't be done a second time because it won't work with your wax body. I nodded, paying close attention to her. "All done here." She carefully placed the hair inside a Ziploc bag. "Let's go to your place to gather the other ingredients. I bought the wax in advance." "Are you sure you want to do this for me?" I asked. "Isn't it something evil? Unnatural?" "Oh, evil and unnatural is what they tried to do to you. You'll understand when you meet my sister. But first, let's create your new vessel. My new body was successfully created. I can't recall a lot of details because my soul was being pinned to the wax and the process can be overwhelming to one's senses, but I remember hearing Heather chanting in a lot of bright lights. Moving around with it felt natural, almost like it was my original body. However, it came with a number of limitations. Heather recited them to me after I spent a few hours learning how to move around in it. Any exam that tries to look inside your body will be unsuccessful and show nothing. You need to avoid getting sick at all costs if you don't want to be studied as a medical aberration. Your body cannot take more than 5 minutes of sunlight a day, and sunscreen doesn't work. The only way is staying indoors as much as possible and always protecting your face with a hat. You can make your body turn to dust at will and reappear in another spot within your view. However, you'll be even more vulnerable to sun for a week after each time. Your body will immediately melt if it touches salt water, hot water, or acid substances. Keep that in mind even for trivial tasks, and always wear gloves just in case. At least once a month, you need to ingest wax to strengthen your body. A single candle will suffice. Is that all? I asked. It isn't that bad. My sister Susan will explain the last rule to you, Heather announced. And a woman who looked just like her but several years older and in white scrubs entered the room. A Miss Laura Thompson. I'm happy to see you well, she greeted me, and we exchanged formalities. You must recall that your fiance's mother was very ill before your accident, right? I nodded. The details are irrelevant, but that family has been doing it for decades. They approach someone. That's what your fiancé and his parents, she did the air quotes, have done to you, like vampires. Are they vampires? It was all my brain could gather. Heather bit her lip and nodded on what it has to do with the last rule. The last rule says that you owe a favor to whoever gives your life back. Anything they want to, Susan replied. Heather was sweating and looked so guilty I felt bad for her, and we want you to dispose of them. Strangely, it didn't seem an unreasonable request. After all, they pretty much killed me. Why shouldn't I defend myself? And what you have to profit from it? I asked, my brain finally functioning again. You see, Susan smirked, and in an instant her sclera turned yellow, her irises turned crimson, and her skin became purplish, with a leathery texture. Her canines were huge and her whole presence emanated menace and malice. We are rivals. Next story. One of my students has been writing horrific stories. The heat never even woke me up. I lay there as the sun's rays crept through the window and slowly poured themselves over me. When I eventually woke up, I knew right away I was late for class. You just get this feeling in your gut when something is wrong, don't you? My wife was the one who'd always set the alarm for the morning. It slips my mind before bed every now and again, now that I'm sleeping alone. When I'm late, it means my daughters are late because I'm their alarm clock. I've asked them countless times to set their own alarms, but they don't listen. When the system fails at my end, it fails at theirs too. I shake them, hollering and hooting until they're up and ready to go. Scowls appear on their little faces when I tell them there's no time for breakfast. Just get in the car and they can get something quick at morning interval. I kiss them, Abby, the eldest, on the forehead, and Lucy, the youngest, on the cheek when I drop them off at their school. Abby's face contorts in faux horror as she rubs at the impact zone, while Lucy smiles a bright "I love you, Daddy" at me. I then drive a few miles to my school, find a space to park, and hurry through the front doors. I'm almost running when I pass John. He gives me a disapproving shake of the head, then looks at his watch to confirm my lateness, the 4th time this month. His sympathy for my situation has limits, and I'm certainly pushing them. Then the morning rush was finally over, and I was stood in front of 30 pairs of expectant eyes with a hangover like a dead man's switch, threatening to explode if I let it. "Good morning, class." "Norns." "Good morning, Mr. Smith," in unison. I dread Mondays the most because it's feedback day, and I need to look her in the eye and ask her about another disturbing story. Their creative writing assignments are due in on Fridays. That's when she'll place it meekly on my desk. I shudder a little when I see that neat, looping handwriting of hers. It's the only class I dread the entire week, and it's just my luck it falls first thing on a Monday. These kids are 12 and 13. Most of the stories are just shitty rip-offs of whatever the latest movie is, or simile-ridden adjective fests. Sophie's were always the same though. I'd asked her to try writing in other styles. She'd always smile and say she would, and then I'd get the next chapter of her story on the Friday. Cordelia and Ophelia are two princesses who live in a decrepit castle in a far-off land. They spend their days stealing fruits and meats from the town's marketplace, despite being the daughters of the king. In the first story I read about the princesses' daring exploits, they had been caught trying to steal from the mean old fishmonger, but he'd let them go in a panic after he'd realized she was the king's daughter. I gave Sophie an ah on it. It was refreshing to read something with a little imagination for once. The next Friday, however, the story took a darker turn. I was introduced to the Obsidian Man. The Obsidian Man is never described in detail. It's just this presence in her stories that only Cordelia can see. Sophie would interject him into scenes without much thought, like the story where Cordelia had to find medicine in the town for Ophelia. The Obsidian Man is standing by Ophelia's bed when Cordelia leaves, and then she sees him in the forest. "Who is this character?" I asked her. She shrugged as if she hadn't thought about it much. "What does he do?" "I mean, surely you didn't just put a character like him in without a point. He's just always there." "I dunno." I received another 3 or 4 stories like this. Cordelia and Ophelia would be off on an adventure. While the king was away, the Obsidian Man would always be close by and not really interfering. Then I received the story The Obsidian Man Steps Forward. The Obsidian Man starts whispering to Princess Cordelia in the night. She tries to ignore him at first, but describes how she can't sleep with his voice in her head, a voice that's so low in tone she can feel it in her stomach. I don't want to listen, but I have to. It must belong to a god, Cordelia says. That's when I started noticing Sophie's paling face and darkening eyes. She wouldn't say much in class, and when she did, she'd usually burst into fits of tears. Her hair grew unkempt and her uniform untidier as the days went by. Eventually, I had to say something, so I told John, who in turn contacted her father. John and I sat down with the guy one Friday afternoon in my classroom after he'd agreed to meet us. I told him of my concerns, that Sophie may be writing these stories to express some troubles that she was suffering. Mr. Sterling told us that Sophie and her little sister had become more and more reclusive since his wife and him had separated. He told us that he'd been worried himself, but with 2 kids and 2 jobs, he hadn't had much time to talk to her about it. John suggested that Mr. Sterling was the king, Sophie was Cordelia, her sister Ophelia, and the Obsidian Man was a metaphor for the parents' divorce, a looming presence that Sophie couldn't stop thinking about. He told me to try and encourage Sophie to keep writing about it, that it could be a form of meditation for her. Mr. Sterling seemed happy enough with that, but I wasn't convinced. I think the parallels between Mr. Sterling's situation and my own worried me the most. He was just a guy trying to do the best for his family. "It's just unsettling, Mr. Sterling. She refuses to write anything but these stories," I said, passing him copies. "Sophie would never steal." He almost shouted when I pointed out the stories where the Obsidian Man had convinced her to go to the marketplace and take whatever she wanted. The stories got darker and darker as the weeks went on, and I started to notice a recurring theme in the stories. The king was never around. He'd always be off fighting battles or getting drunk at these grand feasts. The Obsidian Man would make Cordelia do awful things to her little sister Ophelia. He'd whisper in her ear until she just had to obey him to make him stop. Then she'd force Ophelia to drink soured milk until she was sick. She'd prod her legs with tacks and hold her head under the bath water until she came back up sputtering and crying. Cordelia wanted to stop, but she couldn't. It was as if the Obsidian Man was her puppeteer. The king never suspected a thing. The story would always end with the Obsidian Man asking Cordelia to make him a gift to show her love for him. She'd make jewelry from old bottles and paper while he watched on from behind, his dark presence always felt and never seen. I became gravely concerned for Sophie's little sister, Monica. She was in the year below her, but not in my English class. I informed John of these new developments, and to make sure that there was any truth in them, John contacted the king, who told us that he hadn't noticed anything going on between his girls, which didn't surprise me. Reading Sophie's stories were gut-wrenching for me. I'd sit down on a Friday night with a stack of stories and find myself holding my breath as I read over hers, waiting for the horror. Lord, the Obsidian Man became like an ever-present in my life too. On Friday in October last year, I received Sophie's last story. The Obsidian Man Steps Back. When I read the title, I got a little excited that it may be the story of how Sophie finally overcame her fears. How wrong I was. Cordelia had started to sneak jugs of oil, which she'd stolen from the townspeople, into the castle at the Obsidian Man's request. The king hadn't noticed because he was preoccupied with an ongoing war. She had hidden the jugs in the dungeons below the castle, and one day when the king went out on a raiding party, the Obsidian Man told her to douse a castle in it. Pour extra in Ophelia's room. Around the doors and windows too, we must cleanse this place. You are such a good girl, Sophie wrote of the Obsidian Man's metallic voice. The story ends with Cordelia standing outside the castle with a flaming torch in her hand. There's a line of flammable oil leading to the castle, just begging to be lit. The Obsidian Man put a hand on her shoulder. It's icy cold and grips tightly. It's the first time he's touched her. She feels terrified but inexplicably reassured that she's doing the right thing. He leans in to whisper. She feels the cold breath on her neck. I dropped the paper onto the floor. I just couldn't read any further. I phoned John to tell him what I'd read, and he told me that we'd have a chat with Sophie first thing Monday morning. After I hung up, I poured myself a big, satisfying whiskey. I really needed a drink after one of Sophie's stories. The next morning, I woke up in the same chair in my living room, the buzzing of my phone rising me from the stupor. John spoke worriedly on the other end. He said people in the town center had complained that their cars had been siphoned of petrol during the night, some people claiming to have seen a young girl with canisters. The police had summoned the headmasters of all the local schools to try and identify the girl on their tapes. I just knew it was Sophie. They're blurry as hell, he whispered to me. I think you should get down here. I don't know if it was my empathy for Mr. Sterling or my concern for Sophie, but instead of going to the police station, I headed over to their house. Mr. Sterling answered the door and I explained the situation to him. He denied Sophie had anything to do with it at first, but eventually he admitted that he was working night shift the previous night and couldn't account for her. That's when she appeared in the doorway, the look of horror on her face sufficient for a young girl who'd walked into her living room on a Saturday morning, only to see her English teacher sitting there. I asked her about the cars and she denied it, softly at first, but the harder I pressed, she became more and more aggressive. You're not in trouble, sweetheart. We just want to help. I'm trying, I don't know, her head snapped up towards go home. Leave. Go home. She screamed, her eyes rolling back in her skull as her voice contorted. The girl began pounding the wall with her fists, her legs flailing and teeth gnawing. Mr. Sterling pounced to his feet quickly and grabbed his little girl as she had what looked like a seizure on the floor. He's here, he's in the room, I can hear him whispering. Don't listen to him, Cordelia. Quick, hand me that syringe. He barked at me firmly but calmly. I complied and watched as he injected Sophie's arm with a clear-looking medicine. The ease with which he'd done it made me think that this kind of thing was a regular occurrence in that house. Sophie's mouth began to foam as she shook violently one last time before her muscles finally relaxed. My heart wrenched as she came to and began sobbing in her father's arms. He gripped her tightly with a stoic look welded onto his face. I think you should leave now, he said to me. But what the hell was that? Please, leave us alone. I could feel my hands shaking as I walked home. I had not been prepared for that. My feet seemed to respond by directing me to my local corner shop, where a bottle of Calm Me Down juice was calling my name. "You okay, Mr. Smith?" Andy said from behind the counter as I walked through the door. My face must have been visibly white. Yeah, I mumbled as I took my wallet out of my pocket. I pulled a couple of packets of M&Ms silently from the shelf and tossed them on the counter as Andy placed my usual bottle in front of me. "Look," he said, leaning in closer. I wasn't going to say anything, but "is everything okay with you?" "What do you mean?" I asked, puzzled. He poked his head forward to make sure no one else was in the store. "I caught Abby shoplifting here last week. Now I know we go way back, but my Abby? Yeah, she sneaked a packet of fish fingers in her backpack when she thought I couldn't see. Most kids try lifting sweets or booze, I'm not taking it any further, just thought you should know." The fishmonger grabbed poor Cordelia by her long coat. She yelped in pain as she turned towards the angry man. He released her as soon as he recognized the princess face. His heart sank as he realized he'd just violently grabbed the king's eldest daughter Sophie had ridden. I've never ran as fast as I did getting home. I doubt I'll run faster ever again. By the time I reached the house, flames reached out from every window, the roof collapsing in as I stood there, numb. Plumes of smoke and fiery blasts erupted from the window of the Lucy's room, the fire seemingly fiercer there. I could smell that awful burning. Abby was sat in the back garden, kicking her feet and humming as she made daisy chains. A line of scorched grass led from her to the back door. She didn't seem to notice the blaze as she tied knots in the flowers. I sat down beside her and watched on helplessly as the roof came down upon my world. I felt the heat from the inferno on my face and wondered if it was all a dream or if the heat would wake me up. Abby sat up after she'd finished making her chains. She tied one around her wrist and held the other in her right hand. "Is that for me?" I asked from behind a numb throat, pointing to her hand. "No," she said.